Hi, welcome to Bernard's Book Club, and the book that we're currently looking at is The Dawn of Everything by the Davids Graeber and Wengrow. And this is a really epic book, and I'm looking at it over three films, the first two dealing with its ideas, respectively called History and Politics, and a final one devoted to the evaluation of those ideas. And in the last film, and the first on the book's ideas, I looked at their treatment of history, and in today's film I'm going to look at the political dimensions of the book. And of course, it's a deeply political book which takes a political position and seeks to shape our thinking about politics with a clear stance on the human condition in activist politics and in academic inquiry. And these will be the three parts of today's films: the human condition, activist politics, and academic inquiry. And kicking off with the first of these, politics as the human condition, I think the first thing to say here, and I don't think this is controversial, is that the human condition is the start point for any political theory. Famously, Aristotle said, man is the political animal, and stripped of its gendered exclusivity, this is also the position of Graeber and Wengrow, which is to say that they believe that politics is not only what makes us human, it is our defining feature. And a big part of this book is to restore politics and political consciousness to the people of the past. And when I talk about the people of the past, what I really mean is the people of the deep past, perhaps even the deep past. And it's because conventional history robs them of precisely this, their politics and their agency, that the Davids are so critical of what they call the big history thinkers, people like Steven Pinker and Jared Diamond, who, in their view, dismiss pre-modern people as a sort of primordial human soup of unthinking humanity, helpless and passive victims to larger forces they can neither understand or do anything about. And for the same reason, they see the models of history that these purveyors of big history present us with, not as most people would understand history, as a record of our achievements as a species and over time, but rather as an imposed and abstract scheme of staged historical development, which once again renders the people of the deep past as those helpless and passive recipients of forces they can neither understand nor do anything about. And in response, they offer an updated version of Aristotle, not man as the political animal, but rather humanity as the political species, an understanding, they argue, slowly coming into view as science gives ever more evidence about our deep past. And it's a view of human politics as practiced by the humans of the past as the art of the possible, where free, imaginative, playful and self-conscious political actors reflect consciously about the world, make bold experiments and embrace all sorts of social arrangements. A world in which women and men have thought about how they want to live and made clear arguments as to why we might take one path rather than another. Which, of course, is precisely what Graeber and Wengrow are doing. They're showing history as a story of multiple paths taken to remind us of the multiple paths we might take. Because, like the people of the past, Graeber and Wengrow are also political actors. Indeed, they might be best described as political activists. Which brings us to part two, politics as an activist position. And this frames The Dawn of Everything as deeply political in this second and more direct way, so that the book can be seen as a form of self-conscious political intervention designed to rekindle our political imagination, anarchist in its overall thrust and very much on the side of the disenfranchised. It takes aim at the powerful and consistently seeks to represent the oppressed and the overlooked. It's there in its defence of the pre-modern people as capable and politically sophisticated. It's there in its attack on Western arrogance and the intellectuals who help sustain it. It's there in its claims that the indigenous people of North America were the real authors of the European Enlightenment, But more than any of these, and of course not exclusive to any one of them, it's also there in the book's feminism, which of all the activist positions they take is the one that they sustain most fully. And that's because the alternative view of history that they offer is a woman-centred understanding of the world and its politics, and the book shows this consistently and in a variety of ways, paying attention to women's experiences and recognising them as important, perhaps even intrinsic to their own theories. It presents women as wielding power, engendering civilization, and as scientists. But perhaps most strikingly, it supports a particular feminist understanding of our deep history, a dramatic and unsettling story of how violent patriarchy destroyed an older, egalitarian and women-centred culture. And taking the first of these, women wielding power, here the Davids make numerous, sometimes passing references to moments and places where this can be found, and two in particular stand out. The first is the political arrangements of the Wendat Confederacy of the Iroquois, whose towns were made up of longhouses run by women's councils, in control of all the essential supplies and the key decision makers. One of whom, the Jigonsase, or the mother of the Wendat Confederacy, witnessed the French army arrest almost the entire Wendat leadership as a prelude to invading, and responded by raising an army and, in terms of leadership, single-handedly outwitting and ultimately defeating the French. And the second, perhaps more evocative example, is that of Knossos in Minoan Crete, whose extensive pictorial art frequently depicted women as authority figures, represented as larger than men and holding symbols of command, while the male figures were depicted either as scantily clad athletes or bringing tribute before female dignitaries in poses of subservience. Indeed, as the Davids have it, pretty much all the available evidence from Minoan Crete suggests a system of female political rule. But perhaps more important than these rare moments of female political power is the way that Graeber and Wengrow want to reframe the idea of civilization, away from male monuments to power and towards a woman-centred culture of social cooperation, civic activism, hospitality and caring for others, whose qualities of political wisdom and mutual aid can be found across our history in what they call hospitality zones, which for them represent what they call the deep history of our civilization, in which, in their words, a moment's reflection shows that women, their work, their concerns and innovations are at the core of this more accurate understanding of civilization. And this is not simply to reduce civilization to hospitality, but to argue that such hospitality zones were also places of quiet but continuous experimentation and innovation, where what they call woman the scientist developed plant-based knowledge, turning wild flora into food, medicine, spices, pigments, poisons and complex structures to develop fibre-based crafts, and which at the same time generated abstract forms of mathematical and geometrical knowledge, in which women, they say, were the true innovators, making discoveries based on centuries of accumulated knowledge, so that, they tell us, instead of some male genius realising his solitary vision, innovation in Neolithic societies was based on collective knowledge accumulated over centuries, largely by women, in an endless series of humble but enormously significant discoveries. And what until now has passed for civilization might, they argue, be in fact nothing more than a gendered appropriation by men, etching their claims in stone of some earlier system of knowledge that had women at its centre. But perhaps the most striking feminist dimension to the book is the very strong support they give to a particular feminist reading of our deep past, combining on one hand a restoration of the work of Marija Gimbutas, and on the other supporting it still further through their own ideas and arguments. And what we have with Gimbutas in her book, The Goddesses and the Gods of Old Europe, is the kind of big-picture grand narrative history usually offered by men, positing what she called an old Europe centred on the Neolithic Balkans and the Eastern Mediterranean, a place where men and women were equally valued and women had both autonomy as well as a prioritised place in ritual. But for Gimbutas, this women-centred culture came to a catastrophic end in the 3rd millennium BCE as the Balkans were overrun by violent patriarchal horsemen descending from the steppes and mass migration from cattle-keeping people known as the Kurgan folk, who established new kinds of societies based on the radical subordination of women and the elevation of warriors to a ruling caste. Gimbutas published her work in the early 80s, and the Davids tell us that her ideas were taken up by all sorts of New Age religions and a whole host of social movements, prompting attack and ridicule. But they go on to say that recent analysis of ancient DNA, unavailable at the time, have now led a number of leading archaeologists to concede that she probably was right, with evidence for mass migration of herding peoples from the north of the Black Sea, as well as extensive migration and the large-scale replacement of population. So that after decades of virtual silence, people are suddenly talking about Gimbutas's work again and taking seriously a feminist grand narrative of how violent patriarchy overwhelmed an older, woman-centred culture which was very much part of what the Davids conceived of as our deep history of civilization. More strikingly, Gimbutas's theory corresponds to Graeber and Wengrow's own conclusions when they apply the idea of schismogenesis, an old idea which they breathe new life into, to the societies of the 4th century Fertile Crescent, which crucially is more or less the same time and place where Gimbutas locates the historic turn to patriarchy. And here, the Davids argue, we cannot really speak of one single Fertile Crescent, but must instead recognise that there were two, an upland Fertile Crescent and a lowland Fertile Crescent, each producing distinct societies with an upland and ultimately patriarchal society and a lowland egalitarian one, which by the 4th century BCE had already entered into a process of mutual and self-conscious differentiation, defining each against the other, or what the Davids call schismogenesis, with the upland societies from 3100 BC onwards across what is now eastern Turkey, making a striking turn to hierarchy, organised around the themes and the symbols of predatory male violence, so that on the edge of urban civilization, at the frontiers of urban life, and at the margins of bureaucratically ordered cities, we find evidence of what Hector Monroe Chadwick called heroic societies, that is to say, a warrior aristocracy defined by their schismogenic rejection of everything that early urban civilization stood for, its writing, its bureaucracy, and especially its equality. And it's also here that for the first time we find tombs of men considered heroic, accompanied to the afterlife with prodigious quantities of weaponry, treasures and drinking gear, all facets of a new patriarchal culture celebrating the beauty and fame of the male heroic warrior in feasting, drinking, spectacle, violence, killing and competitive one-upmanship, all of which can be found in all the many depictions of animal and masculine violence depicted in Göbekli Tepe, as well as in Arslan Tepe, considered the world's first palace, where in 3300 BCE we find not only control over, but a celebration of the means to enact violence in a new aesthetic of personal combat and killing. And in true schismogenic fashion, the more the uplanders organised around male perdition and power, the more the lowlanders tended to organise theirs around female knowledge, shunning monuments and hierarchy in societies where women were co-creators of their ritual life. And like Gimbutas, patriarchy and male violence are central to Graeber and Wengrow's conception of history, endorsing Gimbutas's grand narrative, where patriarchy becomes the template for the absolute power of kings, whose royal houses begin on the fringes of early egalitarian cities, but come to supplant them in dramatic transformative acts of spectacular and arbitrary violence. Outrages whose very extremity establishes these new kings as godlike and above all existing morality and law. And in the kingship states that emerged, all deployed spectacular violence at the pinnacle of the system, and all modelled their centres of power, courts and palaces, on the patriarchal household, a place where violent domination emerges, they say, as perversions of nurture, love and caring. And as argued by generations of feminists that violence and domination begins at home, the Davids tell us the most brutal forms of exploitation originate in the most intimate of relations. Indeed, for Graeber and Wengrow, the role of violence and its distorted link with care is profound. And although they don't develop this systematically, they do see it as absolutely key to our history, as the route by which play kings became serious tyrants, the means by which absolute states were established, the linchpin of heroic warrior societies, and the foundation for kingships and empires, telling us that Pharaohic Egypt, Inca Peru, Aztec Mexico, Han China, Imperial Rome and ancient Greece were held together mostly by authoritarian government, violence and the radical subordination of women. And it may even be key to understanding our current predicament, such that, in their words, it seems to us that this connection, or better perhaps confusion, between care and domination is utterly critical to the larger question of how we lost the ability freely to recreate ourselves by recreating our relations with one another. It is critical, that is, to understanding how we got stuck, and why these days we can hardly envisage our own past or future as anything other than a transition from smaller to larger cages. And here, in their thinking about violence and care, is another example of how Graeber and Wengrow constantly work to find new ways, words and framings to rethink the past as a means to rethink the future. Sometimes, as they do here, they do this by re-energizing old concepts such as schismogenesis and seasonality, but at other times they want to more fully deconstruct old ideas and the ways of thinking that come with them and replace them with new ones. And this is particularly true in their treatment of politics and power, which brings us to the third and final section, politics as an academic discipline. And here their focus is particularly on the academic failings of the widely used, but in their view, ineffective concept of the state, which, like the idea of equality, they argue, is ill-defined, and like the idea of the staged history of human development, only serves to impose a monolithic and ultimately distorted understanding over the really rich and diverse political history of our species. And like all the ideas and conceptual schemes that they take aim at, our idea of the state, they argue, is another example of an idea taken from our modern experience and projected backwards along with a whole series of unexamined assumptions, such as the idea that once societies become sufficiently complex, they will inevitably produce an early version of our kind of politics. But for Graeber and Wengrow, our kind of politics, and particularly our conception of the state, no longer works, and when used to understand ancient society, only functions to obscure and make much more difficult to see what might be original or interesting. And if it's possible to have monarchies and aristocracies and slavery and extreme patriarchal domination without the state, and if it's equally possible to maintain complex irrigation systems and develop science and abstract philosophy also without the state, all of which the Davids claim to have shown, then they ask, what do we actually learn about history by establishing one monolithic political entity to explain it? And just like the conventional conceptions of what constitutes a city or a civilization, which the Davids argue are completely blind to the significance and achievement of many complex and large-scale societies, so the conventional idea of the state is blind to the complex ways that political power has been exercised over time. And the way they suggest we move to a better understanding of ancient politics is to recognise that our modern state is not made up of one, but three different parts and has three separate sources of power, each of which has its own entirely separate history and can exist in many different ways, but which in our modern state have been squashed into a single monolithic form. And as an alternative, they suggest we look instead at how power pivots around either violence, knowledge, or charisma, arguing that by separating these out, we can better see the varied and complex ways that power has been created in ancient societies. And the power that comes from violence they call sovereignty, which is their first principle of power. And in many ways, this is a kind of pure power rooted in force. And it's also the understanding that most closely resembles our contemporary definitions of the state, which is often described as having a monopoly over legitimate violence. The second principle, knowledge as power, is, of course, a very well-known idea. And here it's not control over violence that's at play, it's control over information and also what counts as knowledge, which is particularly important in societies where hierarchies are based on knowledge, irrespective of whether that knowledge is scientific, esoteric, or just mumbo-jumbo. All can be seen as equally potent forms of power. And in our modern societies, we find this in the scientifically applied power of bureaucracy, which, when married to the first principle, sovereignty as control over violence, facilitates a very potent brew, which is to say, when control over violence combines with control over knowledge, this makes for a particularly potent state, and which, as everybody knows, can relatively easily become dystopian totalitarianism. And the third principle, charisma as power, and very much following the sociologist Max Weber, well, this is a dimension of power residing in the human realm, in the realm of personality and performance. The Davids sometimes call this the competitive political field, though it might equally be called the theatre of power, which in our own society is played out in the drama of democracy, which in theory is there to protect us from the totalitarian dangers of the modern state, but which Graeber and Wengrow argue is really more akin to a game of winners and losers played out by larger-than-life individuals, with the rest of us as onlookers, deciding who among the well-born shall be considered best of all. And it doesn't take too long to see how closely this resembles our own political experience. But the key point here, as throughout all their arguments, is that in these suggested new ways to talk about power, the Davids want us to have ideas and arguments which will help us see more clearly the complex sophistication and, above all, the staggering diversity of our history and politics. And in these three principles of social power, which can be expressed and constellated in multiple and varied ways, we have better ideas to do this. And of course, with this approach, the Davids offer their own multiple and varied examples of political experience which goes beyond the mental world of states and the limitations of a state-based outlook, such as the Natchez, whose monarch, the Natchez son, was able to order summary executions and whose presence required no end of bowing and scraping, but whose power could only extend as far as his physical presence. so that most people simply chose to live in villages as far from the palace as possible and lived relatively free lives. Or the Olmec, considered the mother culture of Mesoamerican civilization, whose politics was a constant round of extreme competition between high-ranking families, competing for fame and honour through a series of ball games, and who, in societies that completely lacked any infrastructure for dominating its people, actually presided over the remarkable spread of cultural influence over a huge area and are today best known for their signature achievement, the colossal sculptured heads of Olmec leaders with the leather helmets of ball players. Or there's the Chavan horizon, where between 1000 and 200 BCE, a single centre in the highlands of Peru dominated the surrounding region with monumental art and architecture. But unlike the self-worship of heroic culture, this was art devoted not to human rulers, but to esoteric knowledge, ritual evocation, genealogies, and shamanic journeys. And then there's Tel Sabi Abiad, one of a series of tiny late Neolithic settlements in the Middle East, where around 7400 BCE, more than 2000 years before the appearance of anything resembling a city, we find the first evidence for bureaucracy. Not as we would understand it, of course, but rather in the form of complex administrative devices, in the form of geometric tokens used by a society which was guided by an explicit ethos of equality to compute information in order to make political decisions about work, food, and mutual aid. And here, perhaps, is the clearest example of the political possibilities excluded by traditional thinking, which in this case would confidently assert that bureaucracy was in fact a practical solution to the problems of information management when human societies became too big and too complex. But surely here is a different story, not bureaucracy as the servant of complexity, or even the handmaiden of hierarchy, but bureaucracy as a sophisticated expression of egalitarian politics, a people's bureaucracy, if you will, which seems to have been, the Davids tell us, designed to protect the freedom and equality of its community. And here with Tel Sabi Abiad, a small archaeological site with big implications, we come to use the Davids language full circle, bringing us back to the manifesto stated at the book's beginning and so evident throughout, and which I set out in the last film as having three promises or three dimensions. Firstly, to dismantle the prevailing wisdom concerning our deep past. Secondly, to go beyond wrong questions and dead-end debates. And thirdly, to give our species its due. And with Tel Sabi Abiad, like the old Europe of Marija Gimbutas and the heroic societies of Hector Monroe Chadwick, we have a portal into a different past, taking us almost into a wholly new world, one freed from the fixed, distorting, ineffectual categories of orthodox thinking, which treats people from the beginning as intelligent and resourceful, and shows our species constantly experimenting with how to live, producing remarkable and varied forms of society, which is the essence of politics. And as stated at the beginning, this book is deeply political, with a clear stance on the human condition in activist politics and in academic inquiry. And in doing this, it provides a staggering range of arguments and investigation in a book of great ambition and scale. It is, dare I say it, epic. And how it's done all of this will be the subject of the last and final film.